This webinar is part of Mennonite Church USA's Learn, Pray, Join initiative on climate justice. We have partnered with Mennonite Creation Care Network and the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions to co-host this learning platform. We have over 110 of you who have signed up. This is the largest webinar that MCUSA has ever hosted. And that says a lot about the interest surrounding this topic at this moment. We have gathered the second day of Lent, recognizing that people we know and love are struggling with the realities of climate crisis. Some people are still in denial about climate change, while others are in deep despair of a catastrophic near future. How can congregational ministries help hold the myriads of emotions and move us from inaction to hopeful engagement? We need guidance and wisdom, and for that, we have invited Doug Kaufman and other Mennonite climate leaders, Dr. Christy Miller-Hassad, Dr. Sibo Nukube, I know I'm saying that wrong, and I apologize, I'll get it, and Ken Pitts. I'm honored to introduce you to Doug Kaufman, who has helped to bring these expert panelists this evening. Some of you know Doug Kaufman and his work as the Director of Pastoral Ecology at the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions, Goshen College. He's also a pastor of Benton Mennonite Church, and he began Creation Care Ministries in response to too much manure in the Elkhart River where they baptize, but I'll let him tell you the full story. Doug is completing a THM in Ecology from University of Toronto, and like a good Mennonite, understated and humble of the wealth of knowledge that he has. And most of all, in learning and getting to know him, he truly has a heart of a pastor. And we're really blessed to have him lead us today. Doug, why don't you begin our time for us?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Sue, for that introduction, and welcome to all of you. And I'm very happy to be with you this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. I am going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint, and I think that should be about there. And yes, as Sue said, basically how I got involved in working with climate change does have to do with too much manure being in the river where we baptize people. It's the Elkhart River. We started this about 17 years ago. And as we realized that there's this problem, we started getting involved in something called Hoosier River Watch. Something where we get into the water times a year. It's a citizen science kind of project. And so we learn more about the science of our river and what makes for a healthy river and what we can do about it. But this also got me to start reading the Bible differently and to ask questions of the Bible that I hadn't been asking, and to notice what rivers, how they functioned in the Bible, and to start to realize that creation is not just some scenic background in the Bible, but is also a participant with God in the creation and salvation story. And that's what led me to the University of Toronto. And then it was 2 years ago that I was invited to be part of the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. Luke Gasho and Jennifer Schrock asked me to be the Director of Pastoral Ecology. And so I've led about 7 retreats now of pastors throughout the continent, both in the US and Canada. It's about 150 pastors and leaders. These are photos of the ones in Los Angeles, near New York City, and in Oregon. And so I think we've reached about 15% of MCUSA congregations through these. And kind of my question, as I've looked at the climate crisis, is what is the pastoral role connected with climate change? What can we do as pastors? What can we do as congregations in our communities? And I've focused on more of the psychological and spiritual aspects and moral aspects of the climate crisis. And so looking at the psychology, part of what has intrigued me is this psychological paradox of climate change, that as the climate science has become more convincing, people have become less certain. Either they believe the science or they don't act on it. And this is something that's been going on for about 25 years it finally started to change. This decline in interest started to decline in 2016, so that today 72% of Americans say that global warming is important to them personally, and this is up 16 points since 2015. But even with this shift of that there is more interest, if we look at people's policy priorities for last year, if you look at this graphic, climate change is almost at the very bottom. It's 17 out of 18 of policy priorities. But for the last half year, I've been telling people when I show this graphic, I've been saying, I think this is finally changing. I think it's going to go up. And so this is a survey that the Pew Research Center does every January. And so finally, 10 days ago, the new one came out. And they do a little bit of a different graphic, but the big news here is that climate change finally is a higher priority for people. It's gone from the very bottom, or almost the very bottom, to the middle. It's gone to 11 out of 18. I would still like to see it higher. Interestingly, the environment is now also moved from the middle to the top. The economy is not the biggest policy concern. Now, the graphics are a little bit different, and what I want to mention there, they wanted to show this year just how partisan and polarized we are on these issues. And so what the blue is what Democrats and Democratic-leaning people are saying, and the red is Republicans and Republican-leaning. And so one other thing to note is that climate change is the most politically polarized of all the issues on here. It's more polarized than gun policy. It's more polarized than immigration. So that's becoming an issue that I'm realizing I need to be looking at a little bit more. But just the question of the politicization of it. I want to go back to this psychological element of climate and thinking about how we talk about denial, because we often talk about denial in terms of American conservatives who blatantly deny climate change is happening, who say that it's not they disbelieve the science. But when Kari Norgaard spent a year in a small town in Norway about 20 years ago now, it was the warmest winter in 130 years, and she noticed that people didn't talk about climate change. Even though Norwegians love winter, they love the wilderness, they're social justice advocates, they're environmental advocates, there's all these reasons why you would think they would be talking about it. They believe the science. It's not that they disbelieve the science, but for them, it brought up a whole host of these negative emotions. And in particular for them, they're a wealthy country, and a lot of that wealth comes from their oil reserves in the North Sea. And so there also was this dissonance in their identity. So not talking about climate change was a way of protecting themselves from troubling emotions. And so she identified three types of denial that people use to help manage things like climate change. The first kind of denial is literal denial. It's blatant, factual denial. And an example of this would be someone who denies that the Holocaust happened. It's just blatant. Interpretive denial is a little step removed. The facts aren't denied, but they're given a different interpretation than what you would expect them to have. It's not that nothing happened. It's just that what you think happened isn't really what happened. And so someone might say something like, I'm a social drinker, not an alcoholic. And so for climate, it would be something like saying it's not a serious threat, or that it's not caused by emissions, by carbon emissions. And then finally, there's implicatory denial. And I think that this is the kind of denial that's actually the biggest denial that's used when it comes to climate change. It's not that the facts are denied. It's not that they're given an unconventional interpretation. It's just that the moral, psychological, political, and moral implications are ignored. And an example of this would be if we see someone getting mugged and we decide not to intervene, and there, we rationalize that it's probably dangerous to intervene, but we also aren't doing the right thing in a way. So it's this third kind of denial that's the most complicated and the most prevalent. And it protects us from emotions like helplessness, guilt, fear, and at the bottom, I think it protects us from despair. Now, denial is not a new thing. We see it in the biblical tradition and among the prophets. Isaiah 6 is this powerful passage, the calling of Isaiah. The first part of this chapter is this beautiful image of God in the temple, and Isaiah volunteering to become God's prophet. And when Isaiah asks what to say, we get this difficult kind of message. God says to Isaiah, "Go and say to this people, listen continuously, but do not discern. Look continuously, but do not understand. Make fat the mind of this people, and its ears make heavy, and its eyes make blind, lest it see with its eyes, and with its ears hear, and its mind discern, and it turn and be healed." Isaiah asks, "How long?" And God replies, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate." And so clearly Isaiah experienced denial in his ministry. This passage also reminds us that of this connection between humans and the land, because it's the land that has to be emptied of people before God will reverse the decision to actually help them become discerning people again. So Isaiah experienced denial. Martin Luther King Jr. also experienced implicatory denial in the civil rights movement. His famous letter from a Birmingham jail is not addressed to outright racists. It's addressed to white moderates who are telling him that he is that he's being too pushy, that he's moving too fast with things. And so he wrote in that, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." And he partly saw that one of the things he was fighting against is this idea that things will get better in the future, kind of no matter what. And so he says, human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of people willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. So my work has been asking then, how can our congregations and how can we in our pastoral roles help people to confront this implicatory denial? And these are the primary three areas that I think about, and where I think congregations in particular have a special role to play in helping our society to address climate change. And one aspect of this is the fact that as congregations, we are a social entity. We have a bigger influence because we are a gathering of people. We're not just individuals, and we can be places. The best way to fight denial is to actually be places where we speak about the thing that's being denied. And so to have communal conversations that are gracious yet difficult at times, and to be places where people can come on a regular basis and talk about what's going on, talk about the ways that we're trying to change our lifestyle, talk about ways that we're trying to engage broader society, but also just to be a place where climate change is talked about in our sermons, it's talked about in our prayers, that as we pray for natural disasters, that we might include a confession for the ways that our carbon emissions have contributed to some of these destructive kinds of things. And then another kind of resource that we have as congregations is our ritual traditions, our worship, and that we actually have rituals around lament and grief that help to provoke hope. We call these funerals, and that's when we do this the most often. I think what we need to do when it comes to climate change is to come up with ways of grieving in the midst of ecological losses. And that's part of the wording here, from disenfranchised grief to acknowledged grief. Disenfranchised grief are griefs where there isn't a social norms around how to respond to those griefs, things like miscarriages and that kind of thing. And so ecological grief if we can in our churches start naming our griefs and our laments, it can help us, I think, to move towards a hopeful response. And then finally, I'm just realizing more and more that we need to be places that are advocating for climate justice. And Christy and Sibonokule are going to talk about this, but the people who've contributed the least to the climate crisis are the ones who often suffer the most, both in the US and internationally. And so churches need to help give voice to those who are already and have been for many years experiencing the climate crisis, and to work towards changing things in our society. So I think I will now go ahead and introduce I think I'll introduce the rest of the panel. Is that, I think that maybe makes sense. And then I don't have to fall in between here. Oh, I did have one other, I wanted to end with a kind of reversal of denial, or that God's call in Isaiah 42 says, I, Yahweh, have called you in righteousness to open the eyes of the blind, to bring out prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison. So I want us to be thinking about how we as churches can open our eyes to the climate crisis. Okay, so Dr. Christy Miller-Hesed is our next speaker. She's from Heston, Kansas. She's an environmental anthropologist and was director of Engaging Faith Communities for Coastal Resilience, a project that brought together rural African American church communities with county and state governments and with environmental NGOs to address climate change on the Chesapeake Bay. And then Dr. Sibonokule Ngube from Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, although currently she lives in Goshen, Indiana. She served as the National Coordinator of Compassionate Development Service, the Relief and Service Agency of the Brethren in Christ Church of Zimbabwe. She has about 20 years experience in development, including climate change response, and she's currently a student at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. And then finally, Ken Pitts in Portland, Oregon, Environmental Science School Outreach Specialist for Oregon Metro in the Portland area, 35 years of secondary biology and environmental science teaching. Basically, he gives climate crisis presentations to middle and high school youth. He's part of the Portland Climate Reality Project, and recently he's been joining his wife, Catherine Jameson Pitts, the conference minister, in giving presentations to congregations at the Pacific Northwest Mennonite Conference on climate change. So these are all people who have joined me in different places in the retreats that I've done in different regions. And I'm very excited I consider them colleagues and friends now. And I'm very excited to hear from each of you. So Christy, if you want to go ahead, I will stop sharing and I will mute myself. And yeah, go ahead, Christy.
Well, thanks, Doug, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening or afternoon. I first started studying and working on climate change because of my concern for how it was affecting our natural environment. But more as I've learned more about climate change and its impacts on people, I've become more interested in aspects of climate justice. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Give me just a second. There we go. Climate change is fundamentally a justice issue due to unequal responsibility for causing climate change, unequal vulnerability to climate change impacts, and unequal power to determine how our limited resources are going to be allocated and distributed in response to climate change. So I want to talk about each of these in a little more detail. So first we'll talk about unequal responsibility for causing climate change. And as a brief refresher, our climate is regulated by greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And these include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur hexafluoride. These are called greenhouse gases because they act like the glass of a greenhouse in that they allow light from the sun to reach Earth, but then they reflect some of the heat back to Earth. And they act as kind of a blanket for the Earth. and keep us at a nice, comfortable climate. So greenhouse gases are a good thing, but human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels, has increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And as that concentration increases, global average temperatures also rise. And this has a number of consequences for natural ecosystems and for human communities around the world. So a study by Sampson et al. Looked at who is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And this was a study in 2011 where they're looking at per capita carbon dioxide emissions. And when you look at per capita emissions, you see that these countries that are in red have higher emissions than those countries in blue. And so those countries in red are more responsible for causing climate change than the blue ones. You can also look at the United States specifically, and this comes from a 2007 study by Robertson Park. And while the United States comprises about 4% of the world's population, we're responsible for around 20% of global emissions. A more recent study by Oxfam looked at what they call lifestyle consumption emissions according to how wealthy individuals are. So if you look here at the x-axis, at the top, this is the richest 10% of the world's population. And the richest 10% are responsible for about 50% of total lifestyle consumption emissions, while the poorest half of the world's population is responsible for only 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions. So when we look at responsibility for causing climate change, we see that developed nations are more responsible for causing this problem than less developed or developing. We see that wealthier individuals have contributed more to causing climate change than poor individuals. And there are also studies that have looked at gender and found that on average, men are more responsible for causing climate change than women. And then studies that look at race have found that on average, individuals with lighter skin are more responsible than individuals with darker skin. We also can look at unequal vulnerability to climate change. And vulnerability has to do with risk of exposure to an impact. So for example, if you live along the coast, you have a greater risk for being exposed to a hurricane. It also has to do with sensitivity. When those impacts occur, how sensitive are you to them? So we generally think of children and the elderly as being more sensitive to, for example, illnesses. And then the third component of vulnerability is adaptive capacity. What resources do you have access to help you mitigate the harm from these impacts? And those resources can include financial resources or skills or social networks, friends and neighbors that you can ask for help. So together, these three things make up vulnerability. In 2011, again, Sampson and his colleagues looked at these components of vulnerability around the world and again mapped them. And you can see these areas that are red have a high vulnerability to climate change impacts, while the areas that are blue have a lower vulnerability. Now, if we compare this to the earlier map that showed responsibility, and I had already mentioned this, we see that those who have contributed the least to causing climate change, who have contributed the least in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, are going to be most impacted by climate change. So again, climate change is fundamentally an issue of justice. And then there's a third aspect of climate justice, which is that those groups who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change also have less power to influence how our limited resources are going to be allocated and distributed in response to climate change. They have less power to influence what mitigation strategies are going to be used or who's going to receive financial assistance in adapting to these changes. And it's this third aspect of climate injustice that I've been working on in rural communities on Maryland's Eastern Shore on the Chesapeake Bay. So I want to tell you a little bit about that work. Just to get us oriented, Maryland there, circled in red, of course it's on the Atlantic coast. And if we zoom in, you can see that the Chesapeake Bay, it kind of cuts Maryland in half. And the Eastern Shore is this chunk of land here that is the east of the bay. And this figure shows that we were working, colleagues and I from the University of Maryland were working in 3 counties. And these gray boxes here show the approximate area of these rural communities in which we were working. And I want to share just a few things about these communities. The first is that these communities have very deep historic and cultural ties to the landscape. This area was first settled by Europeans in the 1500s. And this is a picture of Captain John Smith, who famously mapped the area between 1607 and 1609. And this is also an area where rural African American communities were settled after emancipation in Maryland in 1864. And both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass are from this area. Another thing I want you to understand about this area is that it's primarily dependent on a natural resource-based economy. A lot of crab, blue crab, oyster, and fish are caught in the Chesapeake Bay. And historically, there was a seafood processing and tomato canning industry on the Chesapeake Bay. In this picture here on the left, you can see these women are picking crab meat to be canned. But since the 1950s, this area has started to struggle economically as pollution in the bay has diminished catches, and they've seen some of their food processing industry moved overseas. So one thing I want to point out, due to the lifestyle in these and the economy in these rural communities, these rural coastal communities on the Eastern Shore have a relatively low responsibility for causing climate change. They also have a relatively high vulnerability to climate change impacts. And this is an aerial photo of one of the communities in which colleagues and I worked. This right here is Deal Island. And up at the top, that's the Chesapeake Bay. And then all of this rust color along the bottom is tidal wetland vegetation. And much of that is inundated much of the time. So you can see that these rural communities on the Eastern Shore are just utterly surrounded by water. And so they have a high vulnerability to climate change impacts, especially sea level rise. And it's already affecting them in a few ways. So first is that they're seeing flooding. And this is a picture taken on a sunny day. And this is an increasingly common sight on the Eastern Shore, where roads will be flooded to a point that school buses can't pick kids up. Residents have to put on their boots just to walk across their yard. A second impact from sea level rise is accelerated rates of coastal erosion. And then a third impact is salinization of the soil and groundwater. And that's evident in this picture by this stand of loblolly pine. You can see it's dying off. And loblolly pine is actually really common on the Eastern Shore, but it doesn't tolerate salt water. So they can actually watch the progress of salt water moving inland as these loblolly stands die off. So the state of Maryland is actually really working hard to address climate change, and they've been working on it since at least 2008. However, because these rural communities don't have local level government, they're unincorporated, they remain disconnected from the county and state level resources, technical resources, as well as some financial and planning resources. And the state, because it's disconnected from these rural communities, isn't understanding or gaining knowledge about what they're experiencing. And so this is this third aspect of climate injustice, where these rural communities are being excluded from climate change decision-making, and their needs are then being overlooked. So colleagues and I wanted to find a way to bring together, to build some networks between these rural communities that were on the front lines of climate change and experiencing it in their daily lives, and these county and state government employees who were working really hard at adaptation plans and mitigation plans, and to bring them together so that they could learn from each other and come up with strategies that would meet both these sort of statewide goals, but also meet local needs. So to do that, we decided to work with rural churches. I'm going to check my time here. One of the reasons we wanted to work with the rural churches was because there was some level of distrust between the state level government and these rural areas. So by working with churches, which are widely distributed in these rural areas and have a diverse membership and are really familiar with community needs and local environmental changes, and they're very highly trusted, we were able to recruit rural residents to participate in this project. But we also needed an approach that would facilitate meaningful engagement. And I think, Doug, your graphic that you showed from the Pew poll, where it showed how politically polarized we are in this country on climate change, we were dealing with that as well. And so we were bringing together this group of people that came from all across the political spectrum, that had different forms of knowledge. Some people were viewing it as a scientific, technical problem, while others it was their daily experience, and all sorts of different perspectives. We were dealing with science and faith and these issues that were very contentious and a lack of trust. And so we needed to be able to transform this dichotomous, polarizing dialogue and disengage from that, to bring people together to be able to move forward to try to address these issues. And so we used an approach called collaborative learning, and it was developed by a couple of environmental scientists. But as we worked on this, I kept thinking of Mennonites, because it's so much in line with Mennonite values in terms of really listening to all the stakeholders and transforming conflict. So we did see, by using this approach, we were able to move past these points of conflict. We were able to build mutual understanding. We increased trust among our participants, and they started to develop a range of strategies to meet multiple goals. And so what can the church do to address climate change? Well, we need to all do our part to try to reduce emissions. And I think the church can be supportive of that on a couple of levels. Of course, individuals need to try to make changes to our lifestyles, and that's hard, and it's also discouraging. And if I think if the church can be positive and encouraging, we hear so much bad news, but to lift up positive examples and aspirational goals, I think that would be a really important way for the church to help support individual change. But we also need cultural and policy changes. So as Doug mentioned, how can we work together collectively to transform how our community is living? And then we need to recognize that many people are already having to cope with climate change impacts. And we need to walk with these people and advocate for them. And I don't want to take more than my time, so I'll just conclude by saying that I think we have been focused for a long time on transforming conflict, and working to promote peace. And climate change is another issue in which there's going to need to be a lot of work to transform conflict and promote peace. And so we've got a lot of good work ahead of us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Christy, and Sibono Kule, if you want to go ahead and start now. Yeah, unmute yourself.
Greetings of peace to everybody, and I'm sure you've already heard that my name is Sibono Kule, and I come with joy to this forum because we're practically talking about what courses through my blood and my mind every day, almost tempting me to leave what I'm doing at seminary and, keep doing climate activism every day. And I suppose I'm caught between that space of business unusual and business as usual as I negotiate with the world as it turns right now. I come from the nation of Zimbabwe, and somehow coming up to this forum has been providence, because some of the work I was doing in Zimbabwe, and quite recently as a Mennonite Central Committee partner, caught the attention of the Anabaptist community, and I got an invitation to work with Doug and the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions on a project that is called the Global South Voices. And I think this will connect with what Chrissy recently said about working with communities that are affected. I have been working in climate change response and climate finance governance and a multiple integration of other themes as a way of trying to help mitigate and or help communities adapt to the shifting climate. And what we have come to realize about ourselves in Zimbabwe and in some of the African countries where I've been working is that certainly we are living in a high impact zone, and it becomes a privilege to be a voice amongst us here, so that I sort of share the felt temperature of the experience of the shifting climate. I know how when the weather reporters tell us it will be 35 degrees Celsius, and the real feel might as well be 30 degrees. Well, the real feel of the shifting climate in high impact regions, I think, is a serious justice issue that should add more urgency. What with the children, we're seeing the youths leading the cry for a change in policy, a change in behavior. We're seeing the children beginning to cry out louder for more urgent action. And so I also bring this cry as a woman, as a mother, as a farmer, as a development practitioner, and as a sister amongst us, to tell us that despite that there's this spectrum of denial that Doug has shared about, and we have seen the scientific evidence from Christy, the climate is really shifting, and it's real. Of the four possible responses of fright, flight, freezing, and there must be a fourth one that I might have forgotten there. We need to somehow reach out for the low-hanging fruit and figure out a way of having everybody do what they can as part of not only low-hanging fruit, but do what they can with imperfection, and hopefully the small streams of small imperfect actions will create a groundswell that will change in favor of the people that are highly and disproportionately impacted by the shifting climate. Now, what are some of the things we are seeing in Zimbabwe? If you were to do a Google search, Zimbabwe is a Southern African country and we are landlocked. And about 50 years ago, 30 years ago, we were known as the bread basket of Southern Africa, bread basket of Africa. And in fact, some would even want to claim we were a bread basket of the world because of the food diversity that would grow on our soils in Zimbabwe. Now, my work has mainly focused in the western region of the nation of Zimbabwe, though at times I've roved across the country. What has happened in the western region of Zimbabwe is that we are seeing more variability per season. Our seasons have shifted forward by about 8 weeks, which is like 2 months. And what we know on our side of the hemisphere is you are to plant cereals, which are our staple, 25th of November. Each day after the 25th of November, your potential harvest, Mr. or Miss Farmer, is reduced by 120 kilograms per metric ton per hectare. So it means that if you were to do your calculation, once you're 10 days later than the 25th of November, you have no chance at a harvest. Now, 70% of our population depends on subsistence agriculture. And 70% of that farming percentage comprises female farmers. Now, you would know the gendered aspects of food production in the global South. And you would understand the burden of care that falls upon women when nothing is harvested. And so, historically, we know we've had our problems in the global South in general, Zimbabwe being one of the particularities. And what are some of these problems? We've had running governance problems. We've had running administrative problems. We've had running human rights problems. We've had grant corruption being a serious issue that our nations need to contend with. However, in recent years, the shifting climate has been disenfranchising swaths of the population that depend on the land for a living. You see, the loss of agency by a woman means the loss of agency by an entire family. With food insecurity, it is obvious that there's also water insecurity. And so the rains have been coming in late, and sometimes we've had what would be a month's supply or a seasonal supply of rain falling all within a week. And that in itself has brought in other problems like flooding, and we've begun to contend more and more with issues like cholera and typhoid. And there's other gender complex issues that come with such a situation, such as the higher vulnerability of women, as women spend more time foraging, looking for food, or waiting for their turn to scoop up some water. We've had women and girls to get hold of water for domestic use. And this is where we begin to see how sharp the justice issues around the shifting climate are, in the sense that these communities and the examples that I've already given are low contributors in terms of the carbon footprint. And I think we've seen very good fugues of charts and graphs to show that. And some of the questions that we have been throwing out as we've been moralizing with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solution include the following: to say, who is under your carbon footprint? And perhaps this is a question directed mostly to the audience in the global north. And somehow along the line, we tend to turn around and also shift the question to be, who is under our carbon footprint, in the sense that generationally, we are all beneficiaries of the petrocarbon of development in the world. And because we're generational beneficiaries and we share one ecosphere, one biosphere, it's one earth, somehow we need to change our discussion table and our language and parlance from being discussed around square or rectangular tables to a round table where we try and discuss as equals, as equal brothers facing a common existential problem. And some of the motivation for this has been as follows. If we were to look very closely at the emission tables, you'd realize that the United States and China have sort of like been interchanging places with other nations that are, if not in the P5 of the United Nations, at least we know that they're first world nations, and I've tended to call those global emissions Olympics, because if you go on and look at the Olympics records in terms of the gold medals, the silver medals, and the bronze medals, it's the same nations with the same distribution winning the medals in that pattern. And so we need a generational consensus where we come in and say, let's take responsibility for this as a generation. Let's take responsibility for this as a collective without developing a dialectic language or a binary language of an us and them. Why am I saying this? When we look at the tags, if I were to ask everybody who's on this webinar, if you haven't made your own clothes like I have, you possibly have a tag somewhere that says your garment is made in China. And so you see how there's a link between the consumption in the United States and the production in China. And what this means is we should be pushing for a more sacred form of production and consumption, and trying to think back of how our communities used to subsist within that framework that's called simple living, so that as a collective that's alive today, we begin to unlearn to relearn. That had a low carbon footprint. Now, the shifting climate, amongst the challenges that we're facing in the global south, I feel has become the highest producer of vulnerability. Because if you have 70% of a population unable to eat, 70% of a population unable to access clean, potable water, there's some extent to which you can argue that is a government problem. Because eating has been God's way for provisioning for creation. Drinking has been a natural, water has been a natural commodity, a natural good that God's been giving the earth. And once creation can't access the general commons that come as an endowment from above, then we have a big problem. So I want to take us perhaps to saying a little bit more about what I have been doing, what the churches have been doing in trying to co-create pathways for sustainable livelihoods within this framework that I've just demonstrated. Noting other militating factors that include the following: there are very few remittances that are coming in to support many a household, because in Zimbabwe, for instance, we are subsisting at a level where there's more than 90% unemployment. So which means that our economy, the economy in Zimbabwe is highly informalized, meaning that the tax base is also very narrow. And you can see how the government itself then becomes very limited in what it can do, though we would want to advocate, say, for better governance, because we have many natural resources that, if better appropriated, could take care of creating safety nets. Now we know about what the natural resource curse is in many a nation in Africa. So we don't want to go there, but we want to sort of like stick to the area where individuals can exercise agency. Now, part of what we have been doing is as follows. We have been working with communities to change cropping methods from extensive approaches to intensive approaches. We've been helping households. I think annually for the past 14 years, I've been working with at least 250 households and at most 1,500 farming households to strengthen kitchen and community nutrition gardening. And within these approaches, we've tried to increase gender sensitivity so that communities have a chance at seeing men and women, boys and girls, act as equal partners in community development. We've worked at strengthening community assets that include small dams and encouraged farmers to think about moving away from planting corn. Corn came with the colonizing column. What were we eating at the time? It appears from research that we had some drought-resistant small grains. They're not as palatable as corn, but in trying to unlearn and relearn, we've begun to see that the smaller grains are, though not as palatable, more hardy and drought-resistant. We are exploring working with solar power and clean energy sources. We are working harder at growing livestock, fodder for livestock, and green manure cover crops that cover both people and livestock. I think it's good to note that this may sound ambiguous because some people think that we should stop livestocking. However, what we've discovered with some of the areas where we work is that it appears cattle, quote and unquote, are the best crop that can be grown or reared in the area. Now, another challenge that we've assisted communities contend with is figuring out how to have reliable water sources by increasing irrigation potential. We've been working on market linkage development so that local markets develop that are of necessity not entirely reliant to the larger capitalist market. And one very important thread is peace building, so that there's better community cohesion as we try and bridge the resilience gap. Another important aspect of our work has been trying to help community leaders, men and women, think about what it would look like if human rights were upheld within the community, and what the overall impact has been is that we are seeing that, for instance, conservation agriculture has changed a lot for many households, meaning that it gives a chance for households to at least get some months of adequate household food provisioning despite the late onset of rains. So that has been a big celebrated story. That's at community level, and at civil society level, we have been helping, and I have been part of facilitating dialogue with government and working with the government and the climate change desk to create a national climate response policy. And that's been working very well. And so I've tried there to highlight like the multiple levels at which our interventions have targeted. Now, if I was to be asked what we can do together to steer the ship around, I think this is our chance. And it's a joy to be working with the churches, because I sense that out of our call for to steward the earth, we have a chance to live out our radical discipleship. I believe that the global north and the global south should dance because this is one earth. I'm sure you heard me talk about working on solar power installations because we have abundant sunlight, but the cost of technology is still very high. And I know that here in America, I've seen a lot of churches doing amazing work by getting off the grid, and they too have solar panels. And so what I'm beginning to introduce here is the idea of transitioning. Whatever needs to be done to transition in the global north, I think has an equivalent transition in the global south. But what we need to think about is just transitioning to say, what is the cost of the transition? Because I dare say, development in the global south has no chance of following the developmental stages, the socioeconomic development stages that have brought the first world to where it is now. And some of those development stages can be typified using the Rostovian model, the stage theory. There is no chance to catch up and no chance to kind of imagine, well, we also need to drink up and use up our share of fossil fuels and push to a point where the state of our development is the same as the state of that development in the first world that was achieved via fossil fuel burning. So we need to dance. We need to strengthen regenerative communities of practice, and I am so excited at our community of practice as we begin to discuss like this tonight. We need to reconfigure disaster preparedness as part of our active witness. The Bible narrative is clear that there will be disaster upon disaster, and we have been seeing it. Last year in Zimbabwe, we had a cyclone called Cyclone Idai. Recall I said that we are landlocked, and we had a cyclone hit us coming in from the Indian Ocean, which is east of Zimbabwe, and about 300 households in a settlement called Ngundu were demolished by rocks the size of the size of a standard kitchen, which would be about, say, 5 yards by 5 yards. And we began to see how nature is raging. Nature is hitting back. And so we need a disaster preparedness capacity to be locked into our communities of practice, meaning we need to raise sensitivity, connectivity, management, information systems that will allow us to share, transfer resources, perhaps much faster than we would normally do, because what's been happening is sometimes to get resources, you have to write a project proposal that gets reviewed following a very long cycle, and by that time, the emergency is no longer an emergency, it's a serious disaster. So we have to rethink some of the ways that our institutions are working. Now, talking about radical discipleship, thank you for that. I think some of the points have already been mentioned to say we need to take more action and increase our knowledge, our attitudes. And by that, I'm talking about knowledge, our research, and let's share those research findings so that we not only act from evidence, but we have common actions that have a common and snowballed buy-in. Changing of attitudes, I think, has already been addressed, and changing of practices. There already are some low-hanging fruit, and I'm hoping that people will not freeze, but just from even the 3 R's that I've found in this part of the land where we reduce, reuse, and recycle, that's a very, very good starting point that can build to very high impact action. And above all, I continue to encourage that we look out for the ways that will help us strengthen a generational and intergenerational consensus involving everybody from pulpit to pew, involving our young people and making sure that even older people understand the balance of what it is we are talking about, now that the shifting climate is vague as a concept to most people and political to another swath of our current population. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for those inspiring words, and we will move then to Ken.
All right. I'm Ken, and I have three things that I would like to talk to you about, three sections. One is where I became invested in climate change, education. Two, I would like to talk about what I do professionally, kind of the strategy that we use when I'm talking to about 300 classes of 6th grade through 12th grade per year. And three, I'd also like to talk about some of the work we're doing at Portland Mennonite in the Justice Committee, which I am a part of. I am going to switch over to sharing my screen and go to a PowerPoint. Yeah, so that's me. This is what I do. This first part is about why I do this. Again, about 3 days a week, I talk to an average of 5 classrooms per day, 6th grade through 12th. Oops, let me get over to the other part. And I developed my love of nature as a kid. My family had a farm in Texas back in the 60s. That I was, it was the thing that I loved to do was to go outside and to hike around on that farm. And so I would spend every waking moment that I wasn't doing chores out exploring that land. And I fell in love with nature. I absolutely loved it. And I found out that that's where I am the happiest. I went into biology teaching, and then for 33 years in public schools, I taught in Texas, Kansas, Pennsylvania, California, and Oregon. And especially in California, one of the things that was really important to me was that when I taught students that were from all over the world, all the inhabited places of the world, their families seem to be in Southern California. And one of the things that has really made me care about climate is that I'm not okay with people the rest of the world climate change. Those families were amazing, and I value them. Another reason that I'm invested in climate change is my love of nature has allowed me now with 4 days a week to be out and be a nature guide. And so I take people in Steigerwald National Wildlife Refuge to see what it is that they want to see. And if you go out with me in that refuge, you can find 45 to 80 bird species per day in a few hours. I am a wildlife photographer. The pictures you're looking at are ones that I've taken in the last few days, with one of them being last summer. But I find beauty in nature. I think nature is phenomenal. I love studying its beauty, its intricacies, and to understand wildlife's tendencies so that I can show up, record that, and be a part of that and not disrupt that. So for me, I like having my finger on the pulse of wildlife by being out there, and I do that with photography, and then I'm able to share that with a lot of the students that I talk to. My third reason for really caring about climate change is I'm a papa to a couple of my granddaughters. May is 3, and Noelia is 1, and when I look into those eyes, and I happen to know, for me, eyes are really important. When I look into kids' eyes, I know that they're going to be slammed compared to me. And I don't want that world for them. I would like for them to be able to, going back, I would love for them to be able to still see this wildlife when they are my age. So expanding then and taking that passion of climate change, knowing that this, for me, this is absolutely the game changer. I love going into the classrooms. And again, this focuses on the eyes of those kids. When I look into the eyes of 30 times 5 kids per day, I see that they would like something to be done about this. They are not denying it. They would like to see a future. So what I do, I work for Oregon Metro, which is a sustainability related government that is over 25 cities in our service area that is the greater Portland area. So we currently have a lesson in which we talk about the science. I'm not going to talk about that. I want to talk about a couple of the key components here of how we approach kids with this, students with this, and then moving them toward action, understanding the system, and then moving them toward making a difference. In our presentation, if I were to click into this, and this is a PowerPoint, so that doesn't work, but if I were to click into this, the first thing that we would see, we help students to look at the system that needs to change. And so we will bring this up, we will read it all the way around and have the students thinking about what lines of connection they see in this global economy graphic that we have here. We then, after they brainstorm connections, we have them come up and actually make the connections and explain. And so just real quick, the idea here is to help to understand the system that needs to change. Understand, and are you seeing my arrow when I move it? Understand that this is our source. This is what it is that is important. Our natural resources, our source of oxygen, our source of water, our source of food, clothing, everything. And we also understand from what science is telling us, we need 45% reduction in fossil fuels in the next 10 years. And so we have them mark the fossil fuel part out and then look at what we can replace that with in renewable energy. We then move from, okay, there was a system in a concept map, now let's make it real. And so we show them in this metaphor of the stream of stuff that they are here in this buy and use box in this stream, that they are standing in the stream, and from them, this is upstream, from them, this is downstream. And so we have them predict, where does the most environmental damage take place? Where does the most, in this case, the thing that is pushing our existence, the burning of fossil fuels, where does the most happen? And then we play videos all the way through here while taking data. And so after seeing those videos, it becomes pretty obvious that the American thought of being green and being environmentally conscious has to do with where you put your trash. Probably doesn't make a giant difference when it comes to climate change as to things that happen upstream. And so it's a bit of a paradigm shift, because most of this part up here is hidden from them, but this activity makes that apparent. We then switch to something that helps them, like I'll go ahead and say this, that in our church, we developed the 3 movements of climate change, which I'll come back to. 1, we check ourselves to see what we can do to reduce our own emissions. 2, we need to go bigger than ourselves. And 3, we need to reach back and to help those that have already been slammed and devastated by climate change. So we look at Project Drawdown, which has a goal of reducing carbon dioxide parts per million to a safe level to where the climate can be healed over time, over hundreds and even thousands of years. And we show the students that there's a list of 80, and I'm showing you only 20 of those. There are some of those things in the list make a bigger difference than others. Like number 1 here is an 89 billion ton difference with refrigerant management. Again, drawdown is if these things were done worldwide, not just in the United States. And we realize our students can't really participate in some of these because of where they're at in their lives, but we have left ones out that they can participate in, possibly, depending upon where they're at. Some students will just need to live to the next day. That's going to be their goal, but there are some that could participate in some of these. And so we have taken 8 out, and we hand them these cards, which are represented individually here by these things that they can possibly do that might have something to do with reducing carbon emissions. And when we do that, we allow them to have conversations about which ones they think make the biggest difference. We then come back and we show them what the actual order is. And going back to that downstream thing, you notice where recycling is in this. Number one thing people say in the United States as to whether they are green, environmentally minded, our family recycles. But when it comes to climate change, again, starting with food, something that we all do, there are some things there that make a really big difference. And if we're just in the United States, we'd probably pull driving an electric car up above this, even though that's not sustainable. Over a long time, it makes a difference in the short run here for getting that 45% reduction in carbon. We then move to climate heroes, and we show people that are doing things and going bigger than themselves. And we talk about this being even more important than them reducing their own carbon. And we show heroes like Xavier Cortada, who paint signs for people to show them how far above sea level. People get to talking in Florida when he does this, and then you have a whole community that suddenly cares about climate change because this is 8 feet above sea level. What scientists say is that house will be toast in the next century or two. We also give we have this activity where we hand students a card, and it has on it a part that they act out as climate heroes. And so we have 13 different cards, and you can see we have a wide variety of people here, a wide variety of things, and they get to go around and be that climate hero and meet the other climate heroes within the class time. And so it shows them a wide variety of ways to go bigger than themselves. And I want to just show you, I'm going to go past that one and say that one other thing that we are doing that's really exciting is we have community partners with a high school that we have piloted this with this last year. And we have AP environmental science students that we, at this high school, we talk to them about climate change. We help them in producing their own lessons. There are several different classes. This is one of 2 classes. And so we end up with 65 kids that then go out and talk to 1,200 6th graders. We're hoping to increase that to 2,000 6th graders. So what I love about this is you look at these pictures and you can see these kids look like the kids that they're talking to. And I feel like that's maybe more effective. It's easier to do than having an old white man come in and talk to them about climate change. It's been super effective, highly rated. We're really excited about that program. The last thing that I wanted to talk about, which isn't necessarily the last thing I want to talk about, but it's a good thing to talk about. The third thing is my work at Portland Mennonite Church with our Justice Committee. We have been focusing for the last 2 years at Portland Mennonite on our response to climate change. That has been the focus of our committee. And we have done a host of things. I'll just say that one of the things that we do is education through bulletin inserts. And we will often get up and share and talk about that. But what I'm showing you is one of the bulletin inserts, and the graphics are by Kurt Weaver. And again, this is the 3 movements. And as I bring these up, feel free to look down through there. I just want to point out some of the bigger things that we have done that maybe illustrate some of the ones that are here. We have had, we're coming up on our third plant-based diet potluck, in which we have people bring in their favorite vegetarian foods, and we have a huge potluck. We invite the community in, and we have the recipes to go along with that, knowing that as we move away from meat, that we need some help with that. Let's see. I want to say also what Doug said about having conversations and sermons and having climate change in prayer. That's happening at Portland Mennonite. We're having a lot of conversations about it. We have had a Sunday school class, and I'll just go into the reach out so you can read those while I'm talking about this. But we've had Sunday school classes both at the adult level, which have talked about climate science, looking at the moral and the spiritual issues of it, racism and unjust systems, our dependence on technology, and we've also looked at businesses' role in responding to climate change. And so that has been over the last couple of years. Let's see. And we are also doing things that have to do with, on this reaching out beyond ourselves. I think at Portland Mennonite, at this point, when it comes to climate change, we have to take sides. And so we do become political, and we do show up at rallies, and we do calling, and we do sharing about when political issues, when there's a vote coming up. Last Sunday, we had laptops at the back of the church, and people would come back, hit the touch screen as to where they were on the map, find their representative, and then we would have a slip that would be talking points to contact legislators. And so we do take sides on it. Let's see. And just going to put one last one up here. We are looking for community partners for part of this reach back, community partners for the fossil fuels that we do burn, having carbon offsets go to something that is not out there. And sometimes it seems kind of weird to buy carbon offsets, but we also realize we're in this transition phase and wanting to transition away from car use, transition away from any burning of fossil fuel, but recognizing that we can't do it immediately, and committing to buying carbon offsets to do that. We're currently looking for a community partner for putting those carbon offset monies into like insulation and weathering for homes for people that can't afford to do that, just as one example. It has been a struggle. There has been grieving. There has been celebration. It's been fun. It's been excruciating at times, but we are stepping forward with it. So, thank you for inviting me to do this.